Okay, we're good?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, can I interrupt you? Can you have them introduce themselves as well? First name, last name of the school we're at, and the grade you taught.
That's just for the editor, so we don't always do it.
And do I look at you?
Yes. From now on, look at me. I will look at you except when I also need to look down.
Okay, great. My name's Lauren Hofmayer. I teach 3rd grade at Lighthouse Community Charter School.
So, Lauren, I want to maybe go back and sort of walk you through a set of questions, starting with planning, if I can, and ask you a little bit about how the lesson we saw today built on students' prior knowledge. Can you talk me through kind of, how, from the perspective of how you designed what you wanted to accomplish today, how you took into account sort of students' prior knowledge, and I'd be very interested in your sort of taking it a step further and saying where you see the skills you were working on today developing in subsequent grades and levels around mathematics.
So before this lesson today, we did a lot of work with drawing arrays to represent multiplication, and today the focus was on extending that understanding a little bit. It's procedural fluency around drawing arrays, but also the conceptual understanding of what does multiplication look like in other models, right? And the students earlier in the year have worked with manipulatives. They've used base 10 blocks and grids and different things to draw their understanding, and now the idea is to expand that a little bit more. Today, the goal was to build conceptual understanding and procedural fluency around drawing arrays to help students understand the associative property. The lesson tomorrow, the focus is going to be more on application. So the idea that they'll take this idea that numbers can be multiplied in any order and put that into a real world context. So tomorrow and beyond, the idea is that students are going to be able to say, you know, like the word problems for tomorrow are going to be, if my dad paid me $3 a day, 5 days a week for 2 weeks, how much am I going to make, right? And being able to visualize that and draw a picture to go with it takes that basic understanding of multiplication and extends it to a real world context. So that's what I hope the students can do.
When you're designing a lesson like today's lesson, I'd be interested in how you know that you've set the cognitive demand of the task at the right level. Hard enough to sort of get the kids to engage in productive struggle, not so hard that you're going right over kids' heads. How do you get that right?
It's always challenging to know where to start your lessons. And I think this morning I actually started with a warm-up before the film crew came in, just to get the students ready and their brains engaged in what we're going to be doing during math. So actually this quarter we've been mostly focused on different strategies for adding and subtracting larger numbers. So it's been a while since we've looked at drawing arrays. So what I had the students do first thing this morning was I gave them 3 questions. I just said 2 times 3, 4 times 5, 7 times 3. And I said, draw an array to show how you would solve each multiplication problem. And almost every student just said, oh, 2 times 3, I know that that's 6, right? 7 times 3, 21. I already know these and I know the answer, and why do I need to draw an array? And I said, you know what? It's really important that you know those quickly, right? Fluency is so important because it's going to help you solve lots of other problems down the line. But you also really need to have that conceptual understanding. You need to know what 2 times 3 means, because that's also going to help you solve problems in real world contexts as well. So I said, just show me an array. And it was interesting to see how many of them that was still fuzzy for them, right? Like they had kind of forgotten how to do that, and they needed to model it for them. So when I saw that, I thought, this is going to be interesting when we go into the afternoon, like to see how they do with it. So,
great.
Yeah.
So let's take it very specifically into the Common Core. So can you talk a little bit about the standards and the clusters that today's lesson sort of falls within?
Yeah, so the standard I covered today was 3OA B5. So that's, remind me again what OA stands for. It's the, whatever. Okay, great. So the standard I covered today was 3OA B5, and basically the focus is on students being able to use the associative property to multiply three numbers together, so knowing that they can multiply them in any order and still get the same answer, but also, just as importantly, even though the answers are the same, the order in which you multiply the numbers is going to change what the problem looks like in an array, for example, or in the problems we're going to be doing tomorrow, the order that you multiply the numbers is going to mean something different in the word problem, right? Like you can't draw it. If you draw the problem in three different ways, it's going to mean something very different, right? Even though the number answer you get is going to be the same, if that makes sense.
Perfect. Okay. If we were doing show and tell with your videotape a week from now and you were presenting the lesson to your colleagues and you had to call out which of the instructional shifts were you highlighting today, which ones would you point to and why?
Remind me of the instructional shifts again, or where can I look at them?
They're in your little guide here. I think they're in. Oh, they're not in your lesson. I've got your lesson plan, but I don't have them. If you want to blow through it, I'm happy to blow through it. To be honest with you, I really am. It's the common work of the grade. It's the common work of the grade. It's around questioning, and everyone. Having
equity of voice.
Equity of voice.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So the question is, how did my lesson
right? So
reflect?
If we're looking at the practice, so it's the common work of the grade, it's the essential work of the grade, or whatever the term.
Okay. So basically, focus.
Yes.
Coherence.
Yes.
And
rigor.
Focus, coherence, and rigor. Okay. So my lesson definitely. The focus is on the third grade standard of knowing the associative property, and not necessarily the name associative property. Like they don't need to know that jargon, but they need to know what that looks like, right? They need to know that you can multiply the numbers in any order. I don't even remember if I said in the lesson this is the associative property. I was more interested in seeing, can the students apply this skill, right? Today, conceptually, tomorrow. In a real world context, right? So definitely the focus was on the third grade standard. In terms of equity of voice, like my intention was to have the students have an opportunity first to see me model one example, and then to turn and talk to somebody about what they were thinking, and then have a student come up and show their thinking. I noticed as I was going through the lesson that I actually ended up calling on the same student probably 3 times. I don't know exactly why that happened. I even ended up picking up his paper, and he had already shared in the morning. So the equity of voice wasn't as strong in this lesson as I would have liked. But you know, I have equity sticks in my classroom. I look for opportunities to have different students speak and echo what each other said. I think I did that at one point in the lesson, as I had a few students. If somebody either didn't hear, or I was concerned that somebody might not have understood the concept we were talking about, after one student spoke, I would ask another student to repeat what he or she had said in their own words. So I was definitely looking for that.
So let's go from the equity of voice a little bit to differentiation, if we can. And
Sure.
I paint a picture about the sort of range of where kids were at the beginning of the lesson, and how you approach differentiation, knowing where they are with whether it's something cognitively around this aspect of the math, or whether or not there are other language or learning issues that they're also managing while they're processing the content. I'm curious about if you can give us a sort of flavor of the range of kids' aptitudes and dispositions around the content, and how you handle that in your design and delivery of the lesson.
So whenever I'm planning a lesson, I mean in any subject, but in math especially, I really try to think about making the task accessible at multiple levels, right? So in this particular case, I was thinking about when I was supporting students who were struggling either with the language piece, but it was more just the conceptual understanding mostly. I would tell them to focus first on 2 of the numbers, right? And how would you draw an array for, if it was 2 times 3 times 5, how would you draw 2 times 3 first as an array, and just focus on that part? And then I would say, okay, so now you're thinking about it as 2 groups of 3 4 times. So I was trying to give them that language that we had talked about earlier, but then extending it. And I noticed for the students who were having more difficulty, they may have only gotten to the first sheet, because I had 4 different colored sheets. So for students who were ready, like the students who were got the farthest got to the fourth sheet and had lots of opportunity to practice with different numbers. And then for the students who were still really struggling with that conceptual understanding, they were able to work on that first sheet and just continue to develop that conceptual understanding.
So that would actually be helpful, because I know while it was clear to them and to you, to the folks who are actually watching, it may not have been clear. Those different sheets that they come up and collected were different levels of difficulty of problem. Is that right?
They were, yeah, I think they were slightly more difficult because the last sheet had two of the same, I wanted to find an example here, but the last sheet had two numbers that were the same, I think. Or no, I just actually used larger numbers. So some students were actually, so they just had to work with larger numbers. 7 times 3 times 5 was the third sheet. The first one was 2 times 3 times 4. So just got larger, the numbers just got larger each time. And in the second to last sheet, it was 4 times 5 times 4. So just in terms of grouping them, it might have been a little bit harder to keep track of what permutations they had already done.
How did the students handle the math in the lesson, in your opinion? Did they understand the math?
Some of the students understood the math. I mean, I think they all understood it at the level they were at, right? Like, I looked through all of the work, and every student was able to at least draw an array to represent the first permutation, right? I saw some students demonstrate that they had a strong sense of, they had fluency with the multiplication, so they were able to say, like, in their minds, okay, 3 times 4 is 12. And so they'd say 12 times 2 is 24, and they would just solve it like that without drawing a picture, right? And then I would ask them to show their thinking. And I remember at one point Darwin actually said, oh, I already solved this, I already figured this out. And I said, how did you do it? And he said, I did it in my mind, right? I just knew how to do it. And I said, well, if you already know how to do it in your mind, I want you to try to capture on the paper, like, what that looked like. He said, well, I think it was an array. Actually, I'm not sure if it was an array. So, like, he was really grappling with on some level, I think he was doing a lot of it with fluency, but I'm really also pushing them to have that conceptual understanding.
So given that tomorrow's lesson is going to build on today's,
right,
and that you've just said that there were some students who didn't sort of come out of today at the exact same point as tomorrow, give us a preview for those who are feeling behind in their conceptual understanding as you move toward problems that are conceptually more challenging. What do you do?
Right. So one thing that I've been thinking about a lot in going into tomorrow's lesson is the way I've been thinking about doing it was not having them draw an array, because even though today's work was with arrays, tomorrow it's easier to write just like a $5, $5 to represent how much you're going to be paid each day, right? Instead of drawing all those dots. But I think if students ask, can I draw an array or can I draw a different kind of picture to help me understand this, I'm going to say absolutely. Like, do what makes sense to you. I think the most important thing is in my lesson, to model clearly myself reading a problem, visualizing it, and trying to make meaning from it. And then from there, using whatever strategy you need to, whether it's the one I'm modeling or some other strategy to help you solve it. I would also suggest, I'm definitely going to encourage my students to work together and talk to each other and build on each other's ideas, because that was one thing that I really felt was missing from today's lesson. I really was wanting to see my students talking to each other more and learning from each other and sharing their thinking, which is something we've been talking about since day one, how important it is to learn from each other. So I was a little bit disappointed to see them all, many of them, sitting and working quietly in their own spaces, and I would really like to encourage them more, and I'm going to think about that tonight more, about how I can facilitate those conversations.
How do you, given your point that it's from day one that's been an objective of yours, what does it take to facilitate that both mathematical thinking and discussion when it's not directed by you?
Right. I think one of the most important things is having a safe space where students feel like it's okay to make mistakes and say things that may or may not be right. And so establishing that safe community, I've been really focused on responsive classroom and trying to create a community and an environment where students feel comfortable to share their thinking, whether or not they're sure it's right. So that's one thing that I'm definitely doing. I think another thing that's important is on the carpet or at their seats for students to really listen to each other. And I think that starts with me modeling active listening, right? When a student is speaking, really hearing them. And if I'm not understanding, asking them to clarify, modeling like the language I would want them to use with each other if they're not understanding, and also just providing more practice throughout the year with those talk moves.
How do you know when you've gotten it right?
I think you know when you've got it right because you can step back a little bit and the students run things more. There are elements of the day, like our morning meeting, where there have been times where I've had to step out of the room to talk to a parent and I've come in and the students are doing it themselves. And that's a moment when I say to myself, okay, this piece of the day, the students have autonomy. Like, they don't need me, they can do this part. And I would love to be able to present a problem, for example, or a situation or a context, and then step back and they know how to have that conversation. I feel very lucky to have them again next year. I'll be teaching 4th grade with the same kids. And really, I see so many opportunities already when you talk about reflection. I see so many opportunities to think over the summer about ways that I can facilitate those conversations better next year.
So on the topic of reflection, if you were to go back and sort of review the tape and you could say, here's what I do exactly the way I did it and here's what I do differently, what comes to mind?
Sure. So one thing I think I would do differently maybe is to have the students on the carpet, give them more opportunities to talk about their thinking a little bit more. There was one opportunity for turn and talk. I was trying to strike a balance between having them be on the carpet for a certain amount of time and also having that solid independent work time. But I would maybe have had them do at least one more turn and talk and check in to make sure that they're really understanding before I had them go back to the carpet. I may have also had students, maybe one other student, come up and talk about, I think they needed a little bit more support with permutations, like the different orders, putting the numbers in different orders and how to know what you're doing first, right? So with the parentheses. So I definitely would have probably done some more modeling and also had them come up and practice a little bit more before they went off to independent work. So
to go back to the larger topic from this, well, let me do it at a simpler level maybe to begin. If miraculously you had been teaching this lesson a year or two ago, same kids, same environment, how would it have been different to see you teaching the same set of concepts to the similar aged kids?
So if I had taught this lesson 2 years ago, I think you would have seen me jumping in even more during independent work time. Even today, when you were asking before about what I would have changed, I would have probably even tried to step back more than I did today. I think there were some moments where I jumped in and maybe gave a little too much to the students instead of letting them have that constructive struggle. It's always a balance. It's definitely a balance to know when to jump in and when to step back. 2 years ago, I probably would have been just going up to students, looking at what they were doing and say, have you tried this? Or what about this? Or show me that. Oh, maybe you could try it this way, right? And today I really just said, tell me what you're thinking. That's interesting. I'm noticing this. Or maybe I wouldn't even say I'm noticing. I just ask them to explain what they're thinking. And if they're feeling stuck, maybe asking them to turn to somebody else at their table instead of coming to me for the answer, right? Or the way to solve it. So
why is it more important to do it that way?
I think it's really important for teachers to be facilitators and for students to work with each other and really have that constructive struggle, because that is what's going to happen in the real world. When you approach a novel problem, you're not always going to be able to approach it the same way. So I want to give my students those basic skills, those fundamental skills, but then they need to be able to come to a novel problem, something they've never seen before, and apply these skills to something new. So if I'm always telling them exactly how to do everything, they're not going to be prepared for that.
Are there some students in that class for whom English is not their first language?
Yes.
How do you accommodate them and still engage in that level of rigor?
So when I am supporting the English learners in my class, one of the important things is to give them to practice using the language, those turn and talk opportunities, talking and sharing in smaller groups, and then so that when it's time to share out in larger groups, they feel like they've had the language and the opportunity to practice that language. Often after I'll teach a lesson, I'll make sure that I have visuals around the classroom for students to refer back to, so that they also have that support as well.
the process that has brought you to sort of examine what you do, try different things, look for evidence of how it's working or not working, and continue to adapt. I'm sort of curious this how in your day-to-day life, from planning to whatever else goes into what we sort of shorthand as reflection, how do you go about it? How much of it is formalized in the culture of the school? Mm-hmm. How much of it is informal learning? How much of it is done didactically with you and another colleague or professional in the building? How much of it is collaborative amongst mm-hmm. teachers at grade level or across, grades? I'm curious, what does it look like, and how are you supported in the effort to do this kind of mm-hmm. reflective, analytical work about your profession? Mm-hmm.
So at Lighthouse, reflection is a huge part of our jobs. I think that I would say all of the teachers here kind of do it naturally at this point to a certain extent, because we're always thinking, we create a lot of our own curriculum and we do that together. And so after we teach a lesson, we'll go back and we'll look at it either independently or during our Wednesday collaboration times, we'll look together at the work and say, okay, what worked well, what didn't. We'll look at student work and say, okay, which students are struggling, how can we better support them? So there's a lot of reflecting going on individually and as with colleagues. One thing that I've found a lot is that when I'm talking to my colleagues, especially after we do lesson study a lot in math this year, and I know that they've done it in the past, so we'll watch other teachers teach, and it's amazing how much I've learned, even from watching teachers teaching other grade levels, similar content, that I'll go back and say, I hadn't thought about approaching it that way, or this is something that didn't really work, and that's actually something I'm doing in my classroom too, and just seeing other teachers doing that has helped me refine my practice. So I think reflecting is extremely important.
What for teachers who perhaps have been successful in, let's pick mathematics since we looked at a mathematics lesson, at the elementary level for 5 to 7 years of their career, what would you say to those teachers whose reaction to the Common Core is, I was already a good math teacher. I already know how to teach math. There's nothing different today under the Common Core. What would you say to that person? So I would say that they probably do have a lot of things that they are doing well and that they know how to teach and have had a lot of experience, and that is valuable. I think it's also important to recognize that the Common Core is a shift, and there are some real differences between the way that people have taught math in the past and the way we're teaching it now. I think an important part is really seeing the teacher as a facilitator and knowing that that there are elements of procedural fluency, right, and that conceptual understanding, and also being able to apply to real world contexts that the students are going to need to have that haven't been there in the past, right? And for I want to go, and I don't know whether let me create this profile. I'm a new teacher. I find myself having been part of a preparatory program in a community where, for the most part, what the content I had to teach was not a heavy lift. Kids came with parents who made sure that they were going to get the lion's share of the support and the academic reinforcement they needed to be successful. But now suddenly I find myself working with kids who are not receiving those extra supports, and the Common Core has come on top of it to basically say, I not only have to get them to a point where they can pass an aptitude test, I have to turn them into critical thinkers on top of everything else. This is too sort of difficult a challenge to throw at particularly new teachers. How do you respond to that comment? Well, I think that there are some ways that we can definitely support parents, right? Even, parents who haven't been taught how to think about math this way. That's one thing that I've been thinking about a lot. Like, as teachers, there are definitely changes that we're making with Common Core. Like, we're teaching things in different ways, but it's also in other ways building those conceptual understandings, helping students build those conceptual understandings is actually going to make things easier for us down the road, I think. So that's one thing I've been thinking about, but also to support parents, right?
I know that there have been some initiatives, right, where things are online for parents to see different strategies that maybe they hadn't seen before that are going to give them that support. I know I've had a lot of parents ask in my class for me to send home different strategies that I'm teaching that they may not have seen before that their children are bringing home. So that's definitely something that I would say.
I want to go back to your comment about lesson study for just
Sure.
a second. So one of the arguments about the benefits of the focusing on the major work of the grade is that it helps address the pre-existing problem of curriculum being a mile wide and an inch deep. Can you talk a little bit about, as someone who's been designing lessons collaboratively with teachers, and maybe even take it back to the array lesson of today, can you describe how your flexibility around time is different under the Common Core, and how that may or may not modify the approach you take around taking a kind of unit and pacing out the lessons and time you spend on the conceptual, the big ideas of that unit around third grade mathematics, for example? I'd be curious if the Common Core changes your approach to unit and lesson design around the range of topics you've got to cover and the depth with which you can and have time to go into them.
So one thing that I've definitely noticed is when at the school that I was teaching at before, when I had a book, right, that really had a pacing guide. We didn't have to follow it exactly, but I definitely felt like there was a lot I needed to cover, and it was hard to go deep on any one thing. Now with a focus on Common Core and also the flexibility in my pacing, I'm able to really look at my students' work and see where they are, and if they're ready to move on, like I can go there with them, and if they need extra support to build that foundation so they can be successful with future work, then there's space and time to do that. So I definitely have felt more freedom and flexibility in terms of planning my lessons, knowing that I don't have to be on a certain page on a certain day, right? And that I can really meet my students where they are.
So my last and maybe my biggest question is the following. I think there are plenty of people who feel daunted undertaking what you've undertaken over the last year in kind of adapting your practice, taking children who don't have all of the external supports that we wish all children did have, in a sense, to be successful, and bringing them to high levels of performance. When it looked messy as you were wrestling with how to do this, what did it look like? And which things are the things you still think you're working the hardest to accomplish as you continue to adapt your practice?
So a lot of times when I'm doing lessons where students are exploring and grappling and having constructive struggle, it feels messy, and I'm kind of wondering, am I doing this right? Like, should I stop here and just tell them how to do this? And I felt that way a lot, and I have to keep reminding myself that it is this process. This process is what's going to get us there. Having the students, we talk a lot about persistence and showing persistence, and the students will tell you, they'll tell each other, you got to be persistent, keep working on this problem, you're going to get it, or you'll get it next time, or we'll talk about it later, we'll all get there, right? And so knowing that not everybody has to come away with the right answer at the end of the day, and that there are different ways to approach a problem is so important. And I feel like it's been really exciting actually to make that shift myself as an educator. When I look over my students' work from today, like I said, there were moments where it felt really messy, but it was so exciting to look over their work and see that actually a lot of them are starting to think in these complex and different ways, even that I hadn't realized they were there yet, right? Like they're starting to be able to draw arrays in multiple ways. Some of them were doing some of the multiplication in a different way than I'd expected, and that's okay, because having the same answer every time or getting there the same way every time is not the most important thing.
My last question, as you check for understanding over the course of the year, and since the way in which one would assess conceptual understanding is so different from the ways in which kids have experienced assessment in years past, how do you to what extent is your ability to be successful around the Common Core in math contingent upon your ability to build your own classroom-based assessments for understanding, and how much work and time is going into that, and how is that work and time helping or hindering your ability to kind of plan for each lesson?
So I can do formative assessment every day. I mean, I can walk around and I can see, or I can do checks for understanding on the carpet about what students are understanding conceptually. I think it definitely is taking me some more time to develop lessons where I really get at that basic fundamental understanding, and sometimes the conceptual understanding is a little bit more complicated than the procedural fluency or the algorithm, but it's still also very important that students are able to know fundamentally what's going on when they're solving a problem, because when they get to more complex things, like if they don't have that basic understanding, maybe they can do the algorithm and solve the problem, but they're not ready to apply to more complex things. So that's something I have to keep reminding myself, that little extra time that I might have to plan to make sure that I'm targeting students' conceptual understanding is worth it, so that they can do those other problems that are more complex.
You just came away from the first round of piloting the new assessments. Did your kids take
Yes.
those assessments?
Yes,
when
they
you
did.
looked at those problems, did they strike you as daunting or consistent with the level of work that the kids have been experiencing day to day in the classroom?
I think that it was both. I mean, I think there were certain problems where I said, yeah, this really matches the work we've been doing. The students are ready to think about showing their thinking or talking about their thinking in different ways. Definitely the components where they had to type out an answer. I mean, the typing component, like the literal typing, was a little bit challenging for them, but definitely thinking about and articulating their thinking is something we've been practicing a lot. So I was kind of excited to see them not saying, I don't know how to write about this, because they've been doing that almost every day, just a little bit every day, talking and writing about their math thinking. There were some problems that involved sort of multiple steps. I can't think of a specific one right now, but basically where they had to do some conceptual. They had to have some conceptual understanding and some procedural fluency, but also really being able to apply that to a novel situation. And that's kind of what I've been talking about all along, that they have to have the other pieces in order to look at a new kind of problem and have an idea about how to approach it. So,
That's great.
yeah.
That was great. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
sure.
There's much more to go to.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
No, you were great. It was great. It was exactly what we need. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. I'm glad. I'm really
Are you?
tired.
You
Yeah.
are.
I'm gonna go drink some water and
Get your blood sugar back
Yeah.
up.